Welcome to the Disney Parks Podcast with your hosts, Tony Caselnova from DisneyByTheNumbers.com and Parkhopper John from WDWParkhoppers.com. Keep your hands, arms, feet, and legs inside the podcast at all times. And get ready for the Disney Parks Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Disney Parks Podcast. We are so excited for our guest that we get to present to you Mindy Johnson's highly anticipated book, Ink and Paint, The Women of Walt Disney's Animation, has been released. Now, this groundbreaking book balances the history of America's greatest art form with focus on the remarkable number of unsung female artists who brought Walt Disney's animation to vivid animated life. Mindy has also contributed to several noted volumes on animation history, including the Walt Disney Film Archives, the animated movies 1921 to 1968, and the critically acclaimed celebration of one of Walt Disney's legendary animators, Mark Davis, Walt Disney's Renaissance Man. Now, in addition to teaching various film and animation courses in Los Angeles, Johnson writes, lectures, and creatively consults for major studios and independent production entities. Mindy is also an award-winning playwright, a Grammy-nominated songwriter, and a contributing musician and vocalist on several internationally acclaimed recordings. It is our pleasure to introduce to you Mindy Johnson. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah.
Sort of.
So the first question we like...
The airwaves.
Yeah, right. The first question we like to ask everybody is really how their journey with Disney began. So how did your journey with Disney and this book begin for you?
It goes back a few years.
Right.
Decades even. I began many years ago at Disney working on lots. Actually, few people know this, but I actually did work in the mailroom.
Wow.
at Disney Studios many years ago.
Wow.
And then worked my way into different corporate sides, but I was a little creative fish on corporate dry land. So ultimately, it was working in animation, and then worked also with a number of years within the publicity side of the studio, working with feature film publicity. And then when the home entertainment division was underway, I managed the classic titles, animated titles, and would deal with the global publicity for these great works. And it was such a joy to introduce new generations to these brilliant animated classics. And it was a wonderful opportunity to work with many of the legends of Disney animation.
Sure.
And just get a spotlight cast on some of these unsung artists. So from that's where my expertise kind of developed, and certainly interest and work within animation history. But I'm also a filmmaker and have a long background in production. And I teach film and film history. So it all sort of blended together. And that's where the Tinkerbell book, Tinkerbell and Evolution, stemmed from. And then while working on that book, I'd always had a fascination with the Ink and Paint department. Many years ago, there was quite a thriving group of artists there. And I'd linger as I'd wander past the brilliant colored rooms and was always fascinated with it. But certainly as technology changed, that sort of sadly went away or reduced down to a rather small and almost hidden group. Mm-hmm. And so while working on the classic titles from a publicity perspective, it was really just a joy to kind of rediscover this aspect of animation history and celebrate the remaining artists that we do have at the studio. So that's sort of, I pitched the idea for the book, and it was a very different book idea from what the final book is. But that's another story. So.
It's the evolution of the ink and paint book.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just about as thick as the book itself.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. It's amazing to hear the journey from the mailroom, to different paths down through the road. And this is not a legit question. This is more just being funny. But who has the key to the vault? Because I grew up in that era where when you were working with bringing the home entertainment to the houses, it was always, for the first time ever, Cinderella is coming out of the vault. So who's got that key? Are we one degree?
Oh. I'm sworn to secrecy.
Well, when you started researching for this book specifically, and when you landed on the topic, which is, by the way, as the husband of a very strong woman, thank you, by the way. I'll go ahead and say that now.
Thank you for saying that. Sure. You are welcome.
When you were researching the book, about from start to finish, how long does a book like this take to research and start really putting into words on a page?
Well, if you want to have a normal life, this took me about 5 years. I did not have a normal life during the course of those 5 years. It was pretty focused, pretty intense. When I started the book, I pitched the idea, and working with my editor, who was just superior with just kind of letting me do my thing. We both initially thought this would be a very charming, delightful, look peek into the world of, and lots of tea cakes and adventures in the tunnel of love and dating and social life. And about 8 months into the research process to get a handle on this, I remember calling saying, this can't be a small book. This is a very big story. And this is essentially the other half of animation that no one knows about. So it took a while for me to kind of get my head around, because I had been sold into this myth of, pretty girls who trace in color. And, where we have a wonderful range of terrific books and that are thoroughly researched and exploring animation history. Sadly, the contributions of women and any of the department's past animation are minimally explored, and you get only maybe a sentence or two or a paragraph at most about what women had contributed in terms of color and their evolution through the different ranks of animation.
Right, because you get the story of the 9 old men all the time. Yeah. And you get those stories. And then I remember, and I don't mean this to sound dismissive in any way, so please don't take it that way, but it's that passing glance from The Reluctant Dragon. If you remember that movie, there's that little, there's the girls from the ink and paint department. Moving on. Yeah. And that was... And that's kind of why, and what's interesting is when you go back and look at it again, after you've read the book, Ink and Paint, they really are speaking the truth about, it's sort of passed off as cute little glibs about, secret formulas and everything. Well, in fact, that was the case. And these were chemists. These women were true chemists. As I've said a number of times, this wasn't Betty Crocker's kitchen. This was Madame Curie's lab. And these women developed formulas and solutions and materials and approaches to expanding the realm and range of Disney animation in ways that, frankly, men with pencils couldn't. Right. We love our men with pencils at that time. And there were many women moving, putting down brushes and picking up pencils along the way and hired in directly as in-betweeners and assistant animators and animators.
It's also, though, important to note, as brilliant and extraordinary as the 9 old men were at that time, it was because of their wonderful presence there and their terrific artistry, it was even difficult for men to move up. Those positions were locked. They were, they were the go-to people that Walt could rely on for strong characterizations and movement and interesting animation. And so it was sort of difficult for men as well as women to move. But women were moving, and moving in a far wider way and a far more artistic way than people ever knew or realized, simply because for many years history has a sad history of being recorded, preserved, documented, and archived from a male perspective. Mm-hmm. And when you go back and look through our collective past, we're really only getting half the story. This is essentially the other half.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Was there anything in the research that you found that was shocking or surprising, or something that really kind of, made you go, wow, that's fascinating, or that's crazy, or anything?
Well, all of it, because it really hadn't been explored. But it, for me, starting out, as I said, I thought it would be this charming little novelty of a book. But I've admitted publicly I've underestimated it. But again, that's all that anyone had been led to believe. And that's all that had been researched. So I think some of the biggest surprises or shocks were just how wide-reaching the women had been, and how early on, and how many of their advancements were reframed in such a way that credit was given to animators when it was really still women. For example, 1932's Flowers and Trees, the first animation to receive an Academy Award. It wasn't really, when you examine it and go back and do the research on the time period and why that film is so noted, the animation is nothing new or different. It's the color. It's the advent of color. And that was accomplished solely by the women. Hazel Sewell at the time had one of the most unsung women of animation, and I think such a joy to unearth her story. She's not even mentioned in any of the Disney A to Z's, unfortunately, sadly, and we hope to get that changed. Simply because she was Lillian's sister, people didn't give her any kind of credence. And yet, Hazel, when you look at what she accomplished, she's the first woman to head a major department within animation ever. Walt assigned her to head, they were called blackeners at the time. She separates the roles into, at that point, tracing and opaquing, and then advances the roles into the fine arts of inking and painting. She oversees the transition into color, 3-strip Technicolor animation, and she brings that aspect of animation in such a Herculean, or I don't know what the feminine might be, a Wonder Woman-esque type of reach from, if you look at the earliest black and white, the first Mickey and Minnie playing crazy, to within 10 years, less than 10 years, to the Rembrandt-esque artistry and palette of Snow White. That's unsurpassed by any art director in any other medium. And yet she's one of only 2 women outside of voice talent to get credit in the film. And yet no one knows or acknowledges her for the work that she did.
Yeah.
It's incredible what she accomplished.
Yeah. Did they get even film credits for their work?
Yeah, well, To a point.
Okay.
Credits were kind of a premium,
Right.
as you can imagine, and they were quite costly early on because they're essentially created, painted, animated, inked, painted. So they're just as costly as a scene or a new character might be to a film, if you boil it down to cost. So in Snow White, it was pretty rare at that point for a woman in any role to be receiving a credit. And Hazel Sewell and Dorothy Ann Blank are two women. Dorothy Ann Blank was a writer on the film, and she broke incredible ground by establishing many of the story tenets and character analysis and story breakdowns that are still standard structure story tenets today in animation.
Yeah.
She was doing this in the early and mid 30s. So Dorothy Ann Blank and Hazel Sewell are two women who do receive credit, and deservedly so.
Absolutely. From just a layman's background, we don't know a lot about. No, some of our listeners might know as much as we do because we research it because we're Disney people. But tell us a little bit about. Can you kind of give us a quick overview of the ink and paint department? How many women were working there? Just kind of a quick overview of what they were providing to the animation. I mean, you've already talked about the blackening and the way that they make the lines. Can you kind of give us a little bit of background?
It's a big one to condense, and when you read anything out there, it's then the animation drawings would be handed over to the ink and paint department, where hundreds of pretty girls would trace the drawings and color them, and then it would move on to camera.
Wow.
Right.
That's what everybody knew.
Yeah.
And that's the log line that everybody has gone by, and that every researcher has ever sort of blipped over because all concentration has been given to the animation. However, when you look at it from, if you're sitting in the theater, it's really their artistry you're seeing on screen. Animators' drawings are more or less blueprints, pencil sketches.
Right.
They are sort of the essence of the characterizations and the movement and a lot of magic there, absolutely. But the color involved and the final lines that you're seeing on screen, the women were responsible for. And when you examine what a premium inker would accomplish, it's mastery.
Yeah.
Pencils, again, we love our men with pencils, but pencil lines can be erased, reapproached, roughly sketched, and then cleanup artists come in to find that line. But inkers have to not only taper in and taper out that final line and provide a true arc and sway to it, but they then have to match that from cell to cell to cell to cell over thousands of cells, hundreds of thousands of cells. Painters are working on, inkers and painters are then working on, at least in the classic hand-created days, hand artistry of the animation, would be working on a minimum of 4 cells, usually 4 cells, occasionally 5, and if you got into multiplane, you might have as many as 7 or sometimes 12 layers. And each cell has a cast to it, a color cast to it, sometimes a bluish cast, sometimes a pinkish cast. And every day, working on those different levels, the paints had to be let down to accommodate for whatever level the painter might be painting on, so that it would appear to be the same color once under camera. So the painters had a rubric.
Yeah.
These, multiple levels. You'd have Donald Duck Blue 1, Donald Duck Blue 2, Donald Duck Blue 3, Donald Duck Blue 4.
Wow.
Wow.
Then you would have, this would be true of inkers as well, but you also had to ensure that the lines matched and met. The length would taper at the exact same point, even though the arc would vary slightly. So there was a precision required, and they'd have to dovetail and work off of the inker who would have the scene prior to them, as well as working with the inker who inked the scene following what they were working on. So there's a lot of really strategic coordination. You also had within the department the paint labs and color model artists, color model supervisors, and they were on a real higher echelon working with, they would be in the sweatbox sessions with Walt and the animators and all the high-level people, because they were determining color and how it would be appearing on screen. If things were matching, and they would also be reporting back to the supervisors of inkers and painters if there were issues or problems with their work, as would be the department head, Hazel Sewell or Grace Bailey, Martha Rose Bodie, many women who headed the department. And what's interesting is in the 1940s, the studio created an overflow chart of the production process as they were moving into their new Burbank studios, and about the time of Reluctant Dragon, and touting all that was being accomplished there at the studios. And on that original chart, they completely missed 3 departments of the ink and paint department, because it was sort of locked in a hermetically sealed building, since the work that the women did was ultimately going to be on screen. So dust and particles and fingerprints and everything were all carefully avoided. And when they moved into the Burbank building, it was one of the earliest buildings to have air conditioning. So everything was sort of sealed off, and you wouldn't have people traipsing through on a regular basis, because that could invite dust and debris and things that could ultimately show up on the screen, which would be boulders on the sides of the screen. So that sort of sadly added to the mystique of this department and the sort of invisibleness of this department, very much like the canvas that they worked on.
Right.
So there were also checking departments. There were airbrush departments. There were women who worked with special effects. And the division itself fluctuated depending on the productions, depending on budgets, depending on cost cutting. The paint labs alone produced materials for every discipline in every department. They did different blends of paints for the background artists and different blends of paints for the concept and development artists.
Wow. And
for the consumer products artists and for the front office, they developed stamp pad inks and translucent solutions for special effects. And it ran the gamut because it was a full-on lab, chemistry lab.
Wow.
So it was a very full-service group there. And then, as I mentioned, you have the full checking departments to ensure all of the quality control within the inkers groups and within the painting, and then also within a final check. And sometimes the animation check teams were part of the ink and paint department. Sometimes they were part of animation teams. Wow. And it was more often than not women checking the animation. So it really ranges from how it evolved and different time periods and different production.
Well, that leads me to a question that I've often wondered, and I've never really gotten a good answer for. Was it a decision that was made by Walt or someone in the company that, only animators could be men and ink and painters were women? I mean, you've been asked that question before, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Is there an answer?
Sure. It's not a short answer, but it's kind of why I wrote the book to place you within the context of the time period, because you have to remember, coming out of the 20s, when Disney Brothers started in 1923, women had only had the right to vote for 3 years. Yeah. 19th Amendment passed in 1920. So when you look at the fact that the first employee of the Walt Disney Company was a woman, that was pretty remarkable. When Walt was in Kansas City, he actually had a woman artist working for him with his Laugh-O-Gram studios. Her name was Aletha Reynolds. People don't know this. So this is all part of that myth that look back at history is a very sort of gender-biased look. We look back and we default to the male. In the 1930s, there's that ridiculous Snow White letter that goes around that says, only women do this. Well, my case against that letter is there are several things, and I address it in the book. First of all, it's the Depression, and people were desperate for work, and yet it was a boomtown in Hollywood, and particularly at Disney Studios. So people were hungry for work, and they were flooded with letters daily from people all over the world, really seeking work, and with any sense of, oh, that would be fun, or I'm an artist. So they essentially had to create sort of a polite, thank you, but please stay away. We're unless you're a serious, legitimate artist, here's our polite response back to the letters they received. And in fact, the woman whose family has that letter, and there's a number of them out there, she lived in Maryland, and the studio was not paying for people. Literally would get a letter and start showing up. Oh, I've come here. I got a letter from you, and I've traveled all the way across country because you sent me a letter, and yet it was thank you. We received your material. So they had to start getting a little more cut and dried about it, because it was the Depression, and people would line up daily looking for work. And so they had to start establishing some boundaries. And the woman behind that letter lived in Maryland, and likely may not have been a strong enough candidate as an artist. So it was a polite thank you, but no thank you letter. Yeah. In the 30s, Walt is on record as saying, I don't know why, but women just don't seem to have the power for animation. And you have to remember, before Snow White, in the early 30s, animation was prop falls and gags and visual comedy. It wasn't pathos and story and characterization as it developed into with the advent of Snow White. And we see, when you look back, and when I started digging into this, you look at where women are first starting to appear in key roles at the studio. You have Bianca Mangiali coming in about 34-ish, 33, 34, working in story and concept. Now, her artistry is really delicate and beautiful, just exquisite. I have stunning examples of her work in Tinkerbell and Evolution. And she was not a powerhouse with the line. She was a very delicate and yet extraordinary artist. And Grace Huntington comes in about that time as well. So you have women coming into the story and concept areas as silly symphonies are evolving. And then you have Dorothy Ann Blank coming in. You have the women of the paint lab, Mary Weiser and other women establishing a paint lab of their own, creating their own paints. So you start to see how women are transforming the artistry into a more wider range of narrative. And then in terms of animation, we have women coming in the late 30s after the success of Snow White. It's a boomtown for women, and you have ladies like Retta Scott and Mildred Rossi and Viola Anderson and Ethel Coulthard and Sylvia Holland. Ethel and Sylvia were also part of the story team, but they also were working with Viola and Mildred as early women animators, not only with pencils, but also with pastel and color animation. So when you re-examine films such as Pinocchio and Fantasia especially, you begin to see, and in Snow White, women are animating color. And that's a term that just has been forgotten. It's definitely part of the nomenclature. I found documents that discuss the women of color animation. A terrific example of that is Snow White. When you see the rouge on her cheeks, that's not rouge, it's dye. It's the blush of a dye technique that was developed by Mary Weiser. Now, the myth has been perpetuated, but it's actually a dye technique that came out of the paint lab, and the application technique was also developed out of the paint lab, but the women were animating the movement of that color, as well as the highlights of the hair to Snow White. There were no pencil drawings that they were replicating or trying to transform. They were animating it on their own.
Yeah.
There was a point, too, where during Bambi, the women of the Inkers, the legs of the deer were so narrow that it was problematic. The cleanup artists and in-betweeners couldn't get the legs to lock in properly. And the Inkers finally said, you know what? Let us do it. So they were in-betweening on celluloid.
Oh,
Wow.
So women have always been there. It's just that it's never been explored before.
Right.
When you consider another sort of case in point with women in ink and paint, when you consider that every day their canvas changed.
right.
Yeah.
Paper and pencil, every day, there aren't too many variables. You sharpen the pencil, you keep going. Different seats to the paper you're working on, or registration pens, but it's a pretty established canvas, and you know what to expect. But every day these women came into work, either as painters, inkers within the paint lab. The celluloid could change. The color cast of the celluloid could change. The temperature outside had a variable on whether the paint would apply properly or blend properly, whether the inks would glide smoothly or not. I mean, every day they came in to do their jobs. There was a variable in what they were doing. And they managed to make it happen, and never, ever in the history, at least within Disney animation, never missed a deadline. Even though animators were making changes up to the last minute, these women met their deadline to get it to camera.
Wow.
Again, another factor no one's ever realized.
Yeah. Interesting. So, how did the evolution now, Mindy, from like ink and paint to more digitized animation, how did that change for the ink and paint department?
Well, technology had a lot of influence. And ink and paint was a very costly department when you consider that you have hundreds of artists who have to be trained and of a certain caliber. Just the sheer materials alone. The first year that Mary Weiser developed her paint lab, she saved the company over $6,000 in white paint alone. That's $1936.
Wow.
It was a costly part of production, and Walt was always striving for quality. Cost wasn't his primary focus. He was always striving to advance and to expand what animation could be doing as an art form. And it really is within, when you look at the artistry of ink and paint, where so many of these advances are achieved. But it was costly. So when Sleeping Beauty was in production, at that point, it was the costliest animated film out there, and didn't do as well in the box office initially as it needed to, unfortunately. And Walt was spread very thin with the parks and television and feature films and so many other really terrific areas. So animation on that film sort of lingered over 6 years, just trying to get it accomplished. It's a very beautiful and yet ornate film, working in the CinemaScope ratio. So you've got a much bigger field to be painting and filling. It's essentially 3 times the size of the field used in Snow White. So there are hard costs that are going to accumulate. Literally, the desks that the women were inking and painting at had to change because they needed to be able to lay out these longer celluloid pieces. So it was cost prohibitive, and there was a danger of animation dying out. So you get the advent of Xerox technology, which had a dramatic change, primarily in ink and paint. Simply because inkers now were not, the volume of quality inking was not as necessary. It also required changes to the animators' work. They suddenly had to be very responsible for the final line, and it altered the ranks within production on all levels, but it saved animation in terms of cost. Then when you have the advent of computers, people are a little surprised to learn that computers actually had been woven into animation a good decade or more before we actually realized they were. Disney was very careful to not shock audiences. It was very concerning because there was a qualitative look and feel to Disney animation, and they didn't want to shock audiences out of that. So there's a lot of work, again, behind the scenes and on the part of the women to ensure that that wasn't going to happen, that audiences would still embrace the story and the artistry without this, jarring transition into digital work. So that's another program.
Right.
Yeah.
So the book, we were looking at it again just to freshen our minds to it before we started recording with you. And the book is gorgeous. And you were right. It's not a small book, and it's tremendous in shape and size and content. But the thing that struck me right off the bat was the gorgeous images.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Where did those come from? Were they from Disney? Did Disney actually help you with this? Did the company? Where'd you get the photos from?
That's another story. This is through Disney Visions Deluxe, and gratefully, even though I am independent as a writer, the studio, and because of my years having worked at the studio and having a firsthand sense of all of this, I was granted such terrific support, and I definitely need to acknowledge Becky Klein and Mary Walsh and Mike Buckoff and all the really terrific archival teams at the studio, at the company, really, because this does reach across consumer products, Debbie Spatz and many others there, who got behind this in a way that, they recognized too, okay. And as they started to hear and learn what I was uncovering, everybody just went, yes, this is exciting. Absolutely. What do we need to do? And it shows, it really shows. It was a labor of love, but where there were, and I was delighted to discover within the photo archives even that there were so many wonderful photos, and it really speaks to the fact that Walt and his teams were supporting women all along and bringing in, photographing and documenting that. However, again, as we go back historically, people reach historically for the male story rather than looking to explore the women's contribution.
Well,
so it was a real delightful.
I'm sorry.
Pardon?
It was fascinating because where you, and rightfully so, say the written history of the Disney company is male, they could not suppress the women's true, importance because of the documentation of all the photographs.
Yeah, and the challenge there, though, was many were not ID'd. There were a number, but with getting it was a real challenge to get a lot of these women sort of ID'd in terms of, who they were, what their role was. Many of these women were there for many years. And that's where reaching out to the families, a good maybe 60 to 70, I would say closer to 70% of the imagery in here is from private collections.
Oh, wow.
That's photographs and artwork and material literally digging under beds and into closets. And I've had so many families handing me banker's boxes of materials, photo albums and diaries and love letters and documents saying, please tell our mother's story, tell our grandmother's story. So it just continued to mushroom as more and more items and people came forward, and yet with the volume that's in here and represented, and it's still only a fraction. You'll note that in the back there is what I've been calling a gallery of artists, and that's only a fraction. People think, all the women are in there. No. If they weren't pictured within the context of the book, so you have a place to see them, wherever I had women's voices, and it's written in their voices as much as possible. I try to get as many firsthand accounts and did over almost 130 interviews for the book. Wherever I had a voice or a presence in the book, their photograph is hopefully in the book as much as possible. I have another 130 roughly women ID'd who are not in this book because we simply didn't have enough room. If my editor, and I think wisely so, had to rail me in and say, no, we cannot give you any more pages because it's going to be too unwieldy. Yeah. And I see the point, but that allows for future volumes.
I was getting ready to say, book number
2. It can paint volume 2.
We could go to volume 12, I think, with just a really rich and amazing history of what's involved. But it's been really exciting and rewarding and humbling to have many of these women and their families finally getting that history balanced out. It certainly isn't intending to take away from anyone or anything that's out there. It's there to balance it out and to provide the full scope of the animation process and how women contributed and transformed the animation drawings into the full color, vivid, artistic, extraordinary experiences that we all know and love.
Right, absolutely. And as we finish up here, I just have one more question. June Foray wrote the foreword to your book, and we lost June in July. Did you guys have a very close relationship? Can you tell us really quickly? This is not about June. Obviously, this is about your book. But did you guys have a relationship? Did you know June very well?
I knew June for a number of years. Certainly would see her at a lot of the industry events and backstage at different places. And when I met her at least, 10 years ago or more, it was magic. She was, as her autobiography says, did you grow up with me too? Well, I certainly did. And my brothers and I were, big fans, and she always had such a distinct voice. You could spot, you could tell. Right. There was a quality to her work. And so I've known her for a number of years, and when it came down to sort of exploring the very short list of who would be a perfect candidate for the foreword, June was always there at the top. Her health at the time was not the strongest, and I certainly knew that, but we had to make the effort. We had to make the try. So I reached out to her family, and essentially they said, once they understood the volume and what this would entail and the importance of it, they certainly agreed. And so I worked with them to shape this from June's own work and several interviews that she had conducted. And we read it to her. She blessed it. And that was in March of this year.
Oh,
wow.
So it was just heart-wrenching that she, sadly, she knew this was coming. She saw images from the book but never got to see it in its final form. it's very bittersweet. But since then too, there have been a number of extraordinary women, I think, who not only contributed to this book and had extensive careers in animation, but sadly we've lost recently. Wilma Baker was 99, and when I interviewed her at tender age of 97, she even said, wow, I'll be 100 when this comes out. Can't wait. And she had, was our living history. She worked on Snow White, and
wow.
She's quite a strong presence in the book. Ginny Mack, who was the original model for Tinkerbell, had been an inker and painter and supervisor, worked in the paint labs since the mid-40s. And she was an incredible force. And her story is told within the book. She sadly passed about a month ago at the tender age of 90. Wow. June Patterson passed earlier this year. Annie Gunther, one of the first women to get a credit as a background artist. There were a number of women as background artists at Disney, but Annie was the first to get a credit as a background artist in the 70s. She trained under the great Thelma Whitmer, and sadly Annie passed earlier this year. She's in the book. And most sadly, too, we just lost, as of last week, Carmen Sanderson, who had a 55-plus year career working in every aspect of Disney animation, from ink and paint on through to Xerox, on through to, she's one of the first women to put down a brush and pick up a stylus, and to make the transition into CAPS technology in the 80s, and still continued working into past about 2006 or 2000 roughly, and quite a force, a wonderful, brilliant, funny, delightful spark of life. And sadly, we lost her. She just turned 90. And
wow.
So it's just coming in time, but we are unfortunately losing this rich and living history. So it's an important book for that,
right?
From that perspective as well. And these ladies were remarkable. And there's some wonderful, vivid, delightful characters in there too, just as there were amongst the animators. So lots of great stories and much more ahead. The research continues. And so a quick call out if anyone who's hearing this worked in animation at any studio in the earliest years and days, coming up to about the 1960s, please find me. And I'm building a database and documenting where women were and how they progressed through the industry. And it's a pretty remarkable story beyond just this volume. So lots more ahead.
Yeah, it's one of the things that we kind of do on this podcast is we like to have, people on to tell their story, because once they're gone, there's nobody left to really tell the story. Hopefully their family will do it, but they don't, have the means of, writing a book or doing a podcast, I'm sure, to get their story out there. So it's kind of something we like to try and do as well. Speaking of, how and where can people buy this fascinating book, Mindy?
Well, it's available just out now as of a couple of weeks ago. And certainly there are the online outlets. Any bookstore you can find it at, it's out globally. So certainly Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I'm doing a number of signings and events, and you can find those dates and locations on my website, which is mindyjohnsоncreative.com, all one word. And we're keeping a pretty robust events page happening. And I hope we're looking at getting some dates set up in different parts of the country, and hopefully some foreign travel too. But it's a story that needs to be spread. And spread wide. And the more we can get it out there and talk about these incredible women and their remarkable contributions, I think the better we all are in our understanding of where we've come from. So, please keep an eye out. Lots of events and signings. Many of them have been selling out, which is very exciting. So get there early, and we'll get it out there.
Great. Will these also be sold in the parks if people are heading to one of the...
Yeah, I'm going to be signing at Disneyland, along with a few of the ladies who are featured in the book. This is Saturday, November 4th. We're doing 2 signings. There's a 9 to 11 a.m. signing, and then a 1 to 3 signing in the afternoon.
Okay.
So you may double check. I don't know if they're doing some sort of a fast pass kind of approach, but these different time frames will help to stagger your day. The books were available, but they've been selling out. So we're working, the editors are scrambling to get these into the parks and out there in the stores. The book is going to be featured in the October 15th edition of Booklist, which is the sort of Bible for any it's issued by the American Library Association, and it's sort of the go-to Bible for bookstores and libraries to reference in terms of what they put on their shelves.
Okay.
And what's exciting is they generally do not. It's very rare that they feature coffee table books, which this certainly is. But it's even more rare that they would do something that has a Disney slant, because it's, maybe not as academic. This has got a good blend of a lot of things. And so we're just over the moon, thrilled that Booklist has given it a starred review. And so I think that will expand its availability. So you can certainly check with your libraries to see if they're carrying it. But this is a treasure you'll definitely want to have on your shelves. I'm so humbled that many have been referring to this as the, on the same level as Frank and Ollie's great Illusion of Life. And so we've been lovingly calling this the sister companion to that great work. And I'm just humbled and delighted to have that honor. So
it's definitely not
listeners enjoy.
I would tell people, go to the library and check it out, but you're really going to want to buy it, especially if you're a Disney fan.
Absolutely. And it's something too that, as I said, is the other half of the animation stories show. Very rarely seen imagery, artwork, photographs. A lot of firsts in there.
Definitely. Hey, we want to thank you very much for bringing, these women's stories to life, because it's fascinating. As a Disney fan, I love to read it and see it. And like I said, there's a lot of great imagery in the book besides, all the great words and research that went into it. So it's a must-have. And I want to thank you for your time and coming on here and telling everybody about this.
Absolutely.
Oh, thanks so much, you guys. It's been a delight, and I appreciate the efforts you're doing. We've got to keep this history moving forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. Thanks, and we'll see you in the parks.
The Disney Parks Podcast is not affiliated with the Walt Disney Company. All Disney parks, attractions, lands, shows, event names, etc. are registered trademarks of the Walt Disney Company.
Like a boat out of the blue, fate steps in and sees you through. When you wish upon a star, your dream